finding things very difficult today, you really do need to look back at how they got that way. So I am proposing to read you, with suitable comments, a little bit out of Women's Choices, which is trying to explain this history. Yeah, so we're asking why we haven't had more sensible philosophical views about women a bit earlier. One replies, what happened here, and has so often happened, not only on this topic, is that philosophers who are sliding into positions deeply convenient to them and to those around them simply don't see the absurdity of their positions. Nearly every thinker, however great, has been afflicted with this sort of negligence, blindness, on some topic. Nobody can be attentive about everything. This is usually not fatal, because it is the job of the next philosopher, isn't it, to point out the lapses. But the distinctive thing about the woman question is that nobody did this. Are we still hearing? Are you? Yes, thank you. Negligence just continued. The vested interest involved was, until recently, too strong for any such attention to be possible. About the related question of slaves, the Stoics already had doubts. Christianity, because it arose among a class which included many toads beneath the harrow, quickly settled this matter, at least in theory, though by no means at once in practice. When the trade in black slaves arose, the idea that they were not really human was floated as a justification. I don't think anybody said quite that about women, nearly. Another piece of transparently flimsy theory, usable only because self-interest endorsed it. Some otherwise very wise and up-to-date people like Boswell approved of slavery. It's really worth looking at what they say. Over women, however, as we shall presently see, theory had shifted very little by the 18th century. To say that Aristotelian thought remained dominant is misleading. What remained dominant was custom, an immense load of custom draped only in a small and archaic piece of Aristotelian non-thought. The sight is startling, as John Stuart Mill put it. The social subordination of women thus stands out, an isolated fact in modern social institutions, a single relic of an old world of thought and practice, exploded in everything else, but retained in the one thing of most universal interest. It's as if a gigantic dolmen, that's a stone circle, or a vast temple of Jupiter Olympius occupied the site of St. Paul's and received daily worship, while the surrounding Christian churches were visited only on fasts and festivals. In the 18th century, certain bystanders, notably Helvetius and Tom Paine, did point out that something seemed to be going wrong there. But what they said cut little ice, because 18th century revolutionary thought was so strongly committed to linking, almost to equating, freedom with virility, manliness. It asserted literally brotherhood, the rights of man. As Burns said, a man's a man for all that. Burns, like Rousseau, drew much of his terrific subversive force from having himself been a toad beneath the harrow, a victim. But this experience, it seems, doesn't necessarily produce solidarity with all other toads, only with the toads with whom one can readily identify. The slogan was still one man, one vote. The gigantic dolmen then remained. And this is the point I want to stress, how unique among such causes the women's cause was that nobody was saying anything for so long. I mean, nobody was getting through by saying anything. The gigantic dolmen then remained and can be seen at its most overwhelming in the works of Rousseau himself, that great and genuine champion of liberty. It's been a constant source of amazement and indignation to feminists from Mary Wollstonecraft on that Rousseau's ideas about liberty never extended to women at all. Freedom for him was a male prerogative, and any problems about it were problems about the interaction between groups of males or individual ones. His views on women can be found in the Emile, his book on education. Here, after 4 books on the crucial importance of freedom and self-reliance in the education of boys, and just before a repetition of the Libertarian Manifesto from the Social Contract, with its red-hot denunciation of slavery and its promise that every man in obeying the sovereign obeys only himself, he directs the education of Sophie, who is to be Emile's bride. The general principle here, he says, is that in the union of the sexes, the man should be strong and active, the woman should be weak and passive. The one should have both the power and the will. It is enough that the other should offer little resistance. When this principle is admitted, Rousseau goes on, when this principle is admitted, it follows that woman is specially made for man's delight. Now, how could anybody think that that followed? I am still mystified after many years wondering about that. This, therefore, must be the only purpose of her education. She should have no instruction beyond... You see, the only reason it's worth reading this is because Rousseau is a champion of freedom. He is in the centre of the Enlightenment. Why is he going on like this? This would be the only purpose for her education. She should have no instruction beyond what is needed to please her husband. Obedience should be her first and effectively her only virtue. Her only virtue. Her duty will be entirely to her husband, and since he is wholly responsible for her, she need not understand the reasons for anything which is required of her. She doesn't know if she's doing right or wrong. Her life should pass, so far as possible, in confinement at home. Girls, therefore, he said, should early be accustomed to restraint, because all their life long they will have to submit to the strictest and most enduring restraints, those of propriety. They have or ought to have little freedom. What is most wanted in a woman is gentleness. Formed to obey a creature so imperfect as man, a creature often vicious and always faulty, she should early learn to submit to injustice and suffer the wrongs inflicted on her by her husband without complaint. Now, do you see how extraordinary it is that anyone can say that? Her husband is always telling her maybe to do things that are wrong. Well, that doesn't matter. I mean, she's got to do them because that's what he says. What sort of sense could this possibly make to anybody? It's of some interest that Rousseau himself, a disorganized man, was ruled by women for most of his life. He was poor, he had no sort of resources at all, and various aristocratic ladies saw his talents and took him up and helped him. So, you see, I think it follows, this is the voice of seething resentment, not of triumphant tyranny. But print doesn't make that clear. He could cite good authority. The reasons for this apparently extraordinary one-sidedness are there for all to see in the ancient tradition. Rousseau's political thought operated as much good political thought practice must, with existing categories and concepts, but what he saw clearly and correctly that many of the categories which distinguish male groups or individuals are irrelevant when considering notions such as liberty, even if they're relevant for other purposes. But when you distinguish between men who do so on account of their actions, not their natures, and the right to basic freedoms is based on nature, not on behaviour, groups of men can thus be compared and contrasted, since they're sufficiently alike in nature for injustices to one or another to show themselves. It's by seeing what's possible for someone who is like you to do that restrictions upon your own freedom become apparent. No Aristotelian definition of a woman, no freedom is absolute, but if you accept, as Rousseau did, the Aristotelian definition of a woman, you place her forever outside the realm of possible comparisons. Finally, stuck fast in the functional fallacy, you become incapable of looking at the problem from the women's point of view, woman's point of view, since a functional definition necessitates seeing the thing under consideration solely from the point of view of the user. To justify this, it's a small step to argue that the used has no point of view, or at best that its point of view is not of the slightest importance or interest. Now, just one more paragraph of this. What's remarkable is that this primitive way of thinking persisted in the Central European tradition for so long, not only unchallenged, but without serious attention. You see, the business of slaves was getting discussed quite early in the 18th century, even by the British who weren't seeing slaves. Somehow people had become aware that there was something monstrous about enslaving chaps, blacks, but they weren't seeing any of that about women. If it was true that the basic principles of the Enlightenment applied only to less than one half of the human race, you might have expected the champions of that movement to find this fact an interesting and exciting one, calling for discussion and explanation, even if not for doubt. They did not. Neither Hume nor Kant paid the topic of any serious attention. Now, this may not bother those of you who aren't interested in the history of philosophy, but I think it's extraordinary. Kant, that great architect of the idea of personal freedom, remarked that the only characteristic that permanently disqualifies any person from citizenship in the state, and therefore from the obligation to obey only those laws to which consent has been given, is that of being born female, which is exactly Rousseau's position. Hegel, less surprisingly, thought that the family becomes one person. Yes, that's always a good way, isn't it, of getting around it, yes. One person, we know which person. And that while men were like animals, women were like plants. That is, they didn't have any real individuality. How about that? See? Yes, sorry, just one more paragraph. Rousseau's views on almost every other subject received endless fertile discussion, but not on this one. People just passed it by. Even Mary Wollstonecraft's shrewd, vigorous and fair exposure of Rousseau's inconsistencies in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, did not arouse general discussion. It was a century after the publication of Émile before its author's intellectual heirs got round to this part of their inheritance. Fourier raised the topic, and though Marx himself showed little interest, Engels took it up seriously. He is a bit exceptional, and he could have been followed. In The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, 1884. We shall see indeed he was not altogether successful, but at least he insisted on discussing the matter. And in 1889, John Stuart Mill, to his undying credit, did the job properly in The Subjection of Women, simply saying half a dozen obvious things at suitable length in that book makes the excuses of other people later unconvincing. But even then, no other major thinker took much notice, except, unless we count Bernard Shaw. The topic went on being considered as eccentric. Not one which people were unwilling to talk about, for everybody pontificated about it, but an unsuitable one for methodical, systematic attention. The result was an amazing conventionality. There cannot be many matters on which Freud, Nietzsche, Rousseau and Schopenhauer agree cordially, both with each other and also with Aristotle, St. Paul and St. Thomas Aquinas. But the views on women are the same.
I think one thing that people have often remarked about Mary's work is, on the one hand, it's the extraordinary kind of breadth that it has, covering so many different fields. And that's obvious if you look at any one of her 18-plus books and the innumerable articles and interviews and TV pieces and the like. But it also needs to be said that in that breadth, and what really is extraordinary, is the kind of inner coherence and consistency of her views as they developed. And I just wanted, in what I had to say, to give some sense of that by taking one of her remarks and seeing what kind of unfolds out of it when we think about what's said. So this is a quotation from an early-ish piece, 1973, called, with typical Midgley, Mary's typical kind of elan, "Is moral a dirty word?" And she says this, she's talking about the term moral. Okay? The central job the word does, the one for which it's worth preserving, is to mark, as Philippa Foot suggested, a certain sort of seriousness and importance. And its other implications, whether of form or content, flow from this. Then she goes on towards the end. Now, what happens if we ask, is it not only a serious, but a moral matter? My short and wild answer is that moral is simply the superlative of serious. I'm going to repeat that phrase. Okay? The moral is the superlative of serious. Now, from that one remark, one can unpack a great deal of Mary's thought. Just note, of course, that we don't have a superlative serious in the English language, of course. We have big, bigger, biggest, and we have serious, more serious, most serious. But so the very idea of making that connection, of saying, not that there's a formal grammatical, but there's a conceptual connection between the term moral and the term serious, operating as a superlative, is an extraordinary move. It's a denial of the idea that morality, that moral thinking, is the name of an autonomous realm, as it were, of thought that goes on, in some sense or other, independently. And that was just the kind of model of moral thinking that had been dominant when Mary began and remained dominant in many forms. It comes across in various forms of so-called formalism about moral thinking. The idea that the job of the philosopher is to identify the formal character of moral judgments and never mind what they're actually about. That move goes way back to Kant, to Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. It was also current in Mary's early days in the views of a view called prescriptivism. Okay? That we should be interested in the form of moral judgments, but not in their content. It's also, and Mary saw this, I thought, with a brilliant insight, that it's actually that formalism was also endemic to people like Sartre and Camus even, that is, to forms of existentialism. So that remark that the moral is the superlative of serious sets itself against both those two forms. Both were rooted in different ways in the so-called naturalistic fallacy. Okay? The claim that there's a conceptual difference between facts, okay, and values that could never lead to an ought. That error, as Mary saw it, could be traced back, it usually is traced back to Hume. But that's curious because Hume does put a certain class of facts at the centre of his account, namely those to do with human sentiment and natural sympathy, And it's these, rather than rational inference from empirical facts, which were morally determinative. But he got read, Hume, I think, as asserting some absolute distinction between facts and values, which seems to imply that moral judgment takes place in a realm of its own. And of course, the relevant facts that are being ignored here, some central ones, are those to do with the nature of human nature. So Mary was setting herself against the view that the job of philosophy is to articulate the form of moral judgments and stay away from substantial questions of content. Now, it's true that in the 1980s, something came along called applied philosophy. But that, as it were, had to have a special license to operate. Okay? And it had a journal with the warning title, Applied Philosophy, just in case there was any doubt about that. Mary would have none of that, I think. She thought that the danger here was that the term moral was being left to, as it were, to be talked about by bishops on Sundays and the more salacious topics of the tabloid press. Okay? Moral had become a kind of dirty word, both in the culture and perhaps in philosophy in some sense. So by saying moral is a superlative of serious, Mary is denying that account. But then what's the positive account? Okay? Well, she goes on to say that what is it to think of something serious? She says, what is serious affects something central among someone's system of purposes. And it's that system that we need to know about. But that implies that we need to know then about the nature of the thing we're talking about so we know what could count as essential interest or purpose for it. And so some account now is needed of human nature and the kind of life that's appropriate to us so that we can judge what kinds of things are serious for us. This move is, of course, a kind of Aristotelian move in many ways. And Mary was making this move long before talk about virtues and so-called virtue theory became fashionable again in philosophy. The problem for Mary was that all sorts of other cultural pressures and stories we tell ourselves made us think that we had somehow escaped our human nature so it could no longer be relevant. And so to talk about human nature, talk about that had to be put in the context of thought about animal nature, about our place in nature. And that's where the ethology of beast and man comes into the picture. Mary, in effect, enlisted Darwin and his inheritance in the animal sciences, in the sciences, to rehabilitate the idea of species nature, and with that the thought that we too, like other animals, have natures. If we think more about how we acquire those pictures, it came to seem very important then to start thinking about where those pictures came from, the kind of tropes and images that stood in the way of our recognition of our own species nature. It led to some famous rows, with those as she regarded as misunderstanding the spirit of Darwin's reflections. But also it led to a more general worry, I think, on her part. Rather than, as Wittgenstein had done, just, as it were, identify false pictures, call them out, try to get rid of the pictures that hold us captive, as he said, Mary came to see that pictures of one kind or another were themselves part of the character of human life and nature. It was impossible to throw them out altogether, to live in a kind of metaphor-free state. So she saw her task as trying to make those stories and pictures explicit, point out how partial they were, and seek to not to destroy them, but to, as it were, newly curate those pictures, to trace their provenance, so they could be seen as one picture amongst others in a gallery of species self-portraits we paint of ourselves. And I think her use of very striking phrases is a way of kind of breaking the hold of those pictures upon us. So if we think about the ways that the very striking metaphors she uses, one that comes to mind when she talks about social Darwinists who take one end of the great chain of being and throw it into the future. It's a very striking image, okay, that helps us suddenly to see what's going on there in a new way. It helps to break the hold of that picture and makes new ones possible. It was also necessary, I think Mary came to think, to offer new metaphors and pictures. One of those was that about Gaia, and indeed to offer a kind of meta-account of what all those pictures were doing and how to manage them. And I think in her last book on what philosophy is for, she really engages with that topic. All this was, as we saw in the video there, about breaking down very traditional oppositions and binaries between the ethical and the empirical, mind and matter, nature and nurture, reason and feeling, the human and the animal. But she also came, I think, to see that the process of seeking integration of those partial pictures was not just an intellectual task for our culture, but was mirrored in our own personal struggles to lead an integrated life out of the mess of talents and traits and vices and virtues with which we are contingently gifted. Anna, I think, will talk more about this positive aspect of integration. So the philosophical task of integration, never completed, but to which we constantly aspire, was a mirror then of the personal task of leading and not just living a life. And for this reason, I think, Mary shows us how philosophy or philosophical activity is itself an ethical task. So here's perhaps one picture of Mary's philosophy, perspectival and partial, like any other, if we take as our model her remark that we should think of the moral as the superlative of the term serious.
Ian has wonderfully introduced some of the topics that I'm going to run on with a little bit in my tribute. One of the main characteristics of Mary's work, as Ian noted, is her keen awareness of the importance of accounts of human nature for any philosophizing. She understood that philosophy seeks to help us make sense of the world at deep, fundamental levels. That requires making sense of us, humans, on two counts. We are part of the world we're trying to make sense of, and we are variously constrained and limited in our ability to make sense of things. Most philosophers, of course, understand that too, but too often you might be forgiven for thinking that they want to keep that understanding a secret. Not so with Mary. Throughout her work, she kept all that important prize inside. As part of that approach, she developed her own account of human nature. Ian just touched on it. And part of the way she went about it was quite heretical. She looked to the other animals in search of insights applicable to this animal, the human animal. This is heretical because although we think that if the Enlightenment taught us anything, it is that we are part of nature, that we're not perched on some halfway house between nature and some divinity. Nevertheless, we've still reserved a special place for ourselves. And the marker of that place is reason and morality. For some, that sets us outside of the causal order. But even for the more empirically minded, it is a difference pregnant with normative implications for how we regard the rest of nature, including the other animals. As Mary sees it, yes, we might be uniquely bestowed with rationality, but there is no reason to think that it is of a different ontological order than any of the instincts, values, sensitivities we have amassed in the course of evolution. Rationality serves a purpose that sits perfectly within the confines of the natural. That purpose is to bring into balance the other instincts, values, and sensitivities when they get carried away. So this is how the story goes, according to Mary. We find ourselves with those sensitivities, values, and instincts because, by and large, they have been beneficial to us, but they are liable to overreaching themselves. And this can actually be harmful because it can jeopardize other sensitivities, values, and instincts that matter to us more. So an overstimulated desire for chocolate, if unchecked, will pose a challenge to our desire for healthy teeth. An overstimulated desire to look attractive or authoritative might undermine a desire to be comfortable. As Mary points out, the experience of conflict, the experience of the demands of conflicting sensitivities is common enough, and although it might be more or less profound, she says, quote, "It is always confusing, disquieting, and somehow sinister," end quote. What we long for here, what our nature demands, is integration, again what Ian mentioned. That is, the implementation of a firm and effective priority system the implementation. So integration is the implementation of a firm and effective priority system. We need our values and sensitivities to regain the balance that sees to our well-being. And rationality is simply the faculty through which we inquire what the principles governing that balance are, and the faculty through which and the faculty through which we reorganize ourselves as per those principles. And through this inquiry, she tells us, we meet the law of our nature, which is also the moral law. So the purpose of rationality in this picture just is to help us achieve integration. That is to have our value economy unified. And the authority of reason is the force of that need for integration. Quote, the sanction of resisting the demands of rationality is not just logical confusion, but disintegration, end quote. Since the demands of reason concern the law of our nature, which is also the moral law, resisting the demands of the moral law would also amount to the same fate, that is to disintegration. Hence, moral is the superlative of serious. Nothing could be more serious than disintegration. So, rationality is thus rescinded of any special status. Our biological journey has landed some problems in our way, but also a way of resolving it. And that's reason. And morality is the term we reserve for when those problems are particularly severe. As is always the case with ambitious views, there are a number of fronts that, on which we can press. We might ask whether the law of our nature really is the moral law. Sure, integration consists in putting our sensitivities in their place within a hierarchical order, and sensitivities concerning others are amongst the most important ones for us. They will therefore take precedence over many other sensitivities. But surely the need for integration is itself more important than our sensitivity to others. After all, the need to have our sensitivities to others reflected in integration spins off the need for integration in the first place. Since integration is the implementation of the law of our nature, and the moral law is, I assume, the principle by which the importance of our sensitivities to others is reflected in integration, then the law of our nature must be more important than the moral law. And so the law of our nature cannot be the same thing as the moral law. We might also question the idea that integration makes biological sense, given that in some cases it might be achieved only by self-sacrifice. It is well known that standing up for yourself, or even for someone else, will sometimes involve knowingly putting yourself in harm's way. And let's see if we can get a picture up here that captures Aisha Evans, I think is her name, and she's protesting against police brutality against particularly black men in the US. And there she is. I think that is a picture of integration, if there is one. So this observation, the observation that integration may sometimes be achieved only by self-sacrifice, that in itself might also make us question whether reason, and with it us, are entirely on a par with the rest of nature. Of course, much depends on how we define nature. But if we think that the realm of nature comprises things that can engage in causal relations with each other, and that in the case of living things, these causal channels have evolved to keeping them alive, then since the requirements of reason might call for actions that lead to one's demise, it seems that we have somehow stepped out of that causal order. Staying alive is not always the most important thing. And this seems something of our creation, rather than something directly bestowed by nature. And I should point out that this is something, of course, that can also be observed in other animals. So if this elevates us above nature, then so will it elevate the other animals on which we see this phenomenon. But despite these problems, or despite these questions that could be raised, I think that the core of the notion of integration remains compelling. That is the idea that there is such a thing as integrity or unification of our values, that that thing is of utmost importance and that reason has something to do with it. I think that that core idea remains very attractive. It certainly finds echoes in the vernacular. We talk of getting yourself together or falling apart, making up your mind or being torn, composing yourself or losing the plot. It also is reflected in philosophical discourse. Some of us who believe that there is a fundamental difference between actions and other events often attempt to account for that difference by appeal to agential unity and reason. And nowadays, that is being developed under the guise of constructivism or constitutivism, with Christine Korsgaard still the best-known advocate. So let us keep this idea, the idea that integration is of paramount importance and that it is achieved by reason. Let us keep that idea and consider Mary's work in light of it. Reason works to unify us by thinking. The unity of our value economy is more properly conceived of as the unity of our various ways of interpreting the items in that economy and their relations. You cannot be said to be unified if you think that you're not. So an important part of achieving unification is crafting a story about yourself that has you unified. The notion of crafting a story suggests a certain amount of interpretative leeway, but it doesn't give you a free hand. If someone exploits your trust and defrauds you, you might interpret that as you haven't been a fool, or you might interpret it as you haven't been unlucky. But you cannot properly interpret it as you were just being generous, and that incident reflects your goodness in glorious contrast with the baseness of your fraudster. So integration will be a matter of having a story of yourself where all such relevant interpretations of your values and experiences, big and small, convene around your own activity of integration, that is, around the exercise of reason. Although only you, if anyone, can bring about your own integration, the pictures you create of yourself and the interpretation of experiences that come to form those pictures will often employ stories readily available. So suppose that you find yourself with a powerful desire for chocolate. If the dominant picture available is a Puritan one, you might interpret that desire as the work of the devil. If it is an evolutionary one, you might just see it as simply the instinct to store up carbohydrates in preparation for times of scarcity. Different such pictures will be more or less conducive to integration. They will be more or less helpful in creating a unified picture of yourself that makes for a good life, for a good you. What Mary did in much of her writings was precisely to present pictures of human nature that invite interpretations of yourself more wholesome, more salutary than the alternatives, because they encourage generous, gentle, collaborative relations to each other and to the rest of nature, including animals. And so this is one of her gifts to us, the material with which to pursue your own integration in a manner that makes for a kinder world. And for that, if nothing else, we are in her debt.
I studied philosophy at Newcastle University in the early 1970s, and Mary Midgley was my personal tutor. So I had a weekly meeting with her for 3 years, and that created something of a bond. Mary was very engaging and approachable, and she was a bit of a double act with her husband Geoffrey, who was also a philosophy lecturer at the university. One obituary mentions the Midgleys were welcoming and inspiring to students, frequently holding parties and dinners at their large house in the city. I can confirm that. Mary and her husband Geoffrey were both inspiring lecturers, and I remember some of those gatherings at their big house in the Jesmond suburb of Newcastle. An illustration of the Midgleys' relationship with their students is that years after I had left Newcastle and was living hundreds of miles away, when I contacted them about something, they invited me to go up and stay with them for a weekend. I've ended up staying with them twice, and I'm sure that this prolonged commitment to their students was typical of them and not something unique to me. I've also seen Mary twice in the last 5 years, once in Newcastle and once in London. Some commentators give the impression that Mary might have been quite a fierce person, perhaps a bit dismissive and overcritical, but that is not my memory of her. Mary was indeed very serious about her philosophy, but that was because she saw philosophy as very much more than just a dry academic exercise. Philosophy really mattered as it was about people, important ideas, and an approach to life. I think this sense of philosophy really mattering is borne out, for example, by the long-running dispute with Richard Dawkins, where Mary objected to what she saw as the careless use of language about selfishness. That really mattered to her, as it could affect how we might think about ourselves and each other. The passion for philosophy clearly comes across in Mary's memoir, and the fact that she was still writing deeply felt books into her 90s. Mary taking so seriously her responsibilities to nurture her students is demonstrated in my own case by the fact that into her 90s she could still remember things about me as a student that I had myself forgotten. It would be a complete vanity for me to suggest that I could have had any influence on Mary's work, but after reading Beast and Man, I wrote to her saying how much I thought I had learnt about mind from the family cat. Mary wrote back agreeing that a lot could be learnt from cats. So when Animals and Why They Matter was published, I was particularly pleased to see that a cat had been put on the cover. I feel grateful and privileged to have known Mary and to count her tutoring all those years ago as a lasting positive influence on my life.
Can I begin by expressing grateful appreciation to Peter for that very moving personal tribute and very accurate portrait of Mary's character and some of the admirable features of her as a person. And I must begin with a double apology. First of all, I am seriously underprepared due to the fact that for the 3 weeks up until last Friday, I and my two brothers were wholly occupied with the preparations for Mary's funeral. It proved an enormous challenge to do justice to someone who was such an extraordinary individual and influenced people in so many different ways. So, as I say, this is a work in progress. And the second apology is that the reason I have I'm speaking on this particular subject is because I was asked to speak at tomorrow's launch of the Midgley Archive in Durham on two kinds of philosopher, Geoffrey and Mary Midgley. So my father is now very little known as a philosopher. His last published article was published in 1959. 9 years before Is Moral a Dirty Word, which I think was Mary's first published article. So in terms of Michael Frame's categorization of different kinds of intellect in The Tin Men, a wonderful philosophical, humorous novel, which, if you don't know it, about an institute for artificial intelligence, which Mary was particularly fond of. So one of the characters in it is very worried about whether he possesses a cerebrum dialectici, which is that of a brilliant analytical mind which peaks at the age of about 25, or on the other hand, cerebrum senatoris, which grows in width and wisdom over the years. And it's possible that Mary and Geoff provide a good example of those two. But also, I think, very sadly, Geoff, who was an extremely gifted philosopher. His early work is quite brilliant, and I am in the process of compiling an anthology of those early papers, which we discovered, a cache of unpublished papers about 10 years ago, that most of them very early, but really, really brilliant work for somebody so young. I hope that these will eventually come out, but if anyone is particularly interested, I'll be happy to supply them in electronic form, subject to the usual sort of caveats about respecting copyright and so on. So the second apology is that I'm going to talk about work which has never been published. As I say, I will make that available if anyone wishes it. So on the face of it, I've managed to prepare a few pages, but then I will probably speak extempore and consult my extensive crib sheets here to try and fill out this brief picture. So, at first view, the contrast between the two styles of philosophy represented by my two parents could not be more striking. For Mary, originally a classicist in the traditional Oxford mould, philosophy was first of all a branch of literature, and had it not been for an early passionate love affair with Plato's dialogues, I suspect she would now be remembered as a novelist, poet, or playwright, careers in which I am sure she would have excelled, though I strongly feel that we have reason to be grateful to Plato for sending her in the direction of philosophy. Averse to formal logic and mathematics and physics, and what one might call heavyweight metaphysics, Kant, Hegel, and the early Wittgenstein, for example, her early published work, almost entirely in the field of moral philosophy, clearly bears the marks of this literary heritage. Such papers as Is Moral a Dirty Word?, On Trying Out One's Sword on a Chance Wayfarer, and The Concept of Beastliness display a level of creative imagination and stylistic elegance rarely found in 20th century British or American philosophy. Geoff, by contrast, a radar engineer during the war and a pioneer of early computing, one of the few people at the time to thoroughly understand Gödel's theorem and general relativity theory, a specialist on Kant, Spinoza, and Wittgenstein. Surely we have here a classic instance of the gender paradigm of women, right brain, people-oriented, creative imagination, uninterested in science. Men, left brain, mathematical, technologically oriented, linear, analytical thinking, uninterested in people. But, as Mary would so often remind us in many different contexts, this simple picture is highly misleading. Geoff was also a classical scholar, read French and German fluently, and was very familiar with most of the great English and European writers, loved poetry, was a close friend of the war poet Drummond Allison. Though unlike Mary, he engaged with the highly technical debates in formal and philosophical logic that were considered by the male-dominated Oxford establishment in the mid-20th century to be the heart of philosophy. His targets were very much the same as those Mary also attacked, as it were, from an external standpoint. Geoff's opposition to scientism and scientific reductionism, I think, predates Mary's by a number of years. Not that she was in favour of these things, but until her 40s or thereabouts, she was not much interested in them. So it may well be that in this area, as in others, he was a primary influence on her thinking. Certainly, most of Mary's... difficult to read my own writing. Much of Mary's critique of utopian technological fantasies, such as artificial intelligence, transhumanism, and cosmic speculations such as the singularity and the omega point, if these are different, I am not quite sure, bears unmistakable marks of his influence. Consider this passage from a very early paper, Ethical Responsibility in Scientific Research. This, I think, was written in 1946, and he translated it into German to read it to a group of German students at Heidelberg University. And it's a very prescient paper, and I do hope that we're able to see it in print. But I'll preface it with a remark that he speaks here in terms of his, at the time, very strong Christian faith, which he later repudiated. About 5 years later, he lost his faith and He declared himself an atheist, which was his lifelong declaration. But I don't think that affects the substance of what he's saying. He would have used other language to express it. Sorry. There is, I have admitted, something heroic about the scientific virtue of seeking objective knowledge for its own sake. Nevertheless, to take it as the sole ethical value is so one-sided as to constitute sin, the very grave sin of intellectual pride. Furthermore, it misconceives the nature of the very knowledge which it takes to be the supreme value. Scientific truth is not truth any more than scientific explanation is explanation. We do not possess reality in its concreteness when we know merely how to exploit it. Yet very many scientists deny the existence of anything which does not come within the purview of discursive knowledge. And many philosophers, distinguishing discursive knowledge, factual knowledge, and the knowledge of, for instance, mathematical deduction from intuitive knowledge, which he considers to be the only form of concrete knowledge of the actual nature of reality. And that's the type of knowledge we have when we know a person, as it were, personally, when we're able to identify with them from the inside. They regard knowledge how to handle the world as the only kind of knowledge, and this attitude is the ultimate denial of the Christian valuation of worship. To know the world as it is, to possess the truth, in that sense in which our Lord claimed to be the truth, requires an intuitive knowledge in which, as Aristotle says, the mind becomes one with its object. For us, such knowledge is exceedingly restricted. We can never escape sufficiently from self-centeredness to see much of the reality around us. What we see is for the most part a reflection of ourselves. We go furthest with other human beings, but even here, a lifetime of devotion to one single person gives only a most superficial realization of their essential nature. And yet, even this restricted knowledge requires a self-surrender which is more spiritually significant than all the arduous discipline of science. Its development into what we commonly call wisdom, that wisdom which is accessible to the uneducated peasant as much as to the university graduate, requires, as we know, a true holiness of life. To cast this aside as unscientific, merely because the shadow world of science ranges wide, while wisdom digs deep, is sin in the full sense, and the wages of sin is death. I have tried to show how organized science has the power to mold and to control, if it so wills, the whole structure of human relationships, and to mold the fundamental attitude of ordinary man. If the outlook of scientists and their presentation of it casts out wisdom to make room for technology, we will all bear the consequences of such a sin. Science can of its very nature take no account of the spirituality of the individual. Its fundamental valuation in the sphere of knowledge is of a clear, intelligible system of simple elements which makes the control of nature easy. If this valuation be extended beyond the realm of the construction of theories, then when individual freedom comes into conflict with efficiency, the scientific outlook can admit only the claims of the latter. The modern tendency towards centralization of government and to a social organization which shall not be untidily free, but rather intelligible to the scientific mind of the organizer, the outlook which regards the problems of society as economic or psychological problems, and not at all as human problems, these are in danger of producing a dehumanized society in which life will not be worth living. It would be the ultimate denial of God as a living force in history. So as I say, he would certainly have changed that religious language, but I do not think the essence of what he said is something that he would ever have departed from. And I think we can see in that passage something of what is a continuing theme in Mary's writings almost throughout her philosophical career. But it's a different style of speaking. And I think it's very interesting. It's really only in preparing this talk that I've had the thought that because this is much earlier than anything that Mary ever wrote about those topics, that I've seen that the possibility that a really important influence on her thinking came from Geoff's ideas. So even Geoff's most technical paper on logic, Gödel's theorem of the a priori, very sad that this was never published. Anthony guided me to someone who was able to give a professional opinion of it and said that now it's really 60 years later, it was no longer up to date enough to be publishable, I think. But at the time, it was a brilliant piece of work and really, I think, could have had a very significant influence on the course of development of formal and philosophical logic. But he was so shy of publication, he was so perfectionist that a lot of these rather brilliant pieces never saw the light of day. In fact, he only published 2 full philosophical papers, both in the 1950s, and the effort of producing something that satisfied his own high standards of intellectual rigor, I think he was no longer willing to undergo that. But very sad. So even Geoff's most technical paper on logic, Gödel's theorem of the a priori, is directed against the formalist view that proof in logic and mathematics can be reduced to a mechanical procedure, insisting instead and rigorously demonstrating that truly significant advances in logic or mathematics, such as Gödel's theorem, necessarily demand the application of a type of creative intelligence that is fundamentally impossible for a machine. Dating from 1950, the relevance of this paper to contemporary debate about artificial intelligence, such as those discussed by Mary in What is Philosophy For, Chapter 18, What Kind of Singularity, is strikingly clear. And I'll see if I can pick out something from that chapter that shows the connection. Well, I'll just read through for a bit. So it's about the singularity, this wonderful word, whatever that means. So what is this singularity, if not just an extension of Google? In ordinary speech, the word singularity only appears in the harmless everyday sense of strangeness, oddity, or uniqueness. But outside that context, it has gathered a number of specialized, more or less mathematical meanings, such as a point where all parallel lines meet, and a point where a measured variable reaches unmeasurable or infinite value. Recently, these concepts have been collected and moulded into the idea of the technological singularity, which is the name now given to the phase of profound future change at which machines are expected to become more intelligent than human beings, machines having become cleverer and humans more mechanized. Possibly, too, people and machines may then be simply combined. This idea is now being eagerly supported. In California, there is a thriving Machine Intelligence Research Institute, previously called the Singularity Institute, very reminiscent of Michael Frayn's Institute for AI. And I do highly recommend that book as a good humorous sidelight on this whole topic, which is occupied, among other things, with AI safety research. That is, with finding ways to protect us against attacks by newly empowered and humanized machines that may follow from this startling event. And Ray Kurzweil, self-denominated futurist and founder of the Singularity University, expects that event to happen quite soon, perhaps around 2045. By contrast, Noam Chomsky, the philosopher who has been most carefully thinking through this whole concept of artificial intelligence ever since that phrase was invented in 1956, describes the singularity idea roundly as fiction. Being asked whether he ought to be alarmed that the appearance of machines cleverer than humans might destroy our species, he replied so soberly, "I think we should be concerned about the end of our species, but not for that reason. We should be concerned about it because we are very busy destroying the possibility for peace and survival. We should worry about that, like the latest IPCC report, but the singularity stories are science fiction. When we talk about machines, it's kind of misleading. People have a feeling it's this cute little robot like we had in R2-D2. The reference to machines is a reference to programs, the program that you put into the device that sits on your desk. The device itself is of no use for anything other than maybe holding down papers. It's a paperweight, but it can execute programs. A program is a theory, and about that theory, you ask the same questions that you do about any other theory. Does it give insight and understanding? So Chomsky is firmly deflecting the idea that any content of intelligence, understanding that we see when a machine performs functions is not the intelligence and understanding of the machine. It's something that has been put into it. I do recommend actually that you can find that talk on YouTube if you Google Chomsky Singularity, I think, and it's a very interesting and one of the most powerful refutations of the mistaken idea. There is something that goes under the name of artificial intelligence, which is perfectly respectable and sensible, but it's not intelligence, it's something else. But the idea that machines can have intelligence in the sense in which humans have, I think that talk by Chomsky is one of the best demolitions of that idea. So we see there, 70 years, more than 70 years after Geoff's early writings, Mary is still mining the same vein of the critique of the excessive ambitions and hubris of a certain kind of attitude to science. Now, it's absolutely not true that either, certainly not Geoff, of course, himself was really a scientist in many ways, but he, equally with Mary, understood the limitations of the scientific attitude and the fact that we need to bring in many different kinds of understanding in order to have an integrated view of our world. I don't know how much of that preoccupation that Mary had throughout her philosophical life came from Geoff. I'm sure it came from interchange of ideas with many other people. But it's interesting that in a lot of ways, in some of these early writings, he prefigured many of the themes in her work. There exists a certain type of narrowly scientific education that tends to bring about, at least in suitable subjects, a chronic deficiency of the imagination, of the imaginative faculty, or rather of a particular aspect of that faculty. Certainly, scientific fantasists such as Barrow and Tipler, the authors of the book The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, which Mary critiques in Science as Salvation, J.D. Bernal or Edward O. Wilson, possess in abundance one sort of imagination, the ability to extrapolate from established scientific concepts to fantastic and amazing fictitious universes. But other sorts of imagination, readily available to people without a scientific education, seem to be sadly lacking. What would it be like to live in Bernal's or Wilson's scientific utopia, where computer-aided, supposedly rational scientific specialists decide all social and political questions by means of a grand, reductive, self-embracing mathematical theory? To fully convey the terrors of such a world would require the literary gifts not of Isaac Asimov, but of Franz Kafka. In this understanding and in the consummately skillful use of literary techniques that, as Geoff showed so clearly in his essay on the importance of literary style in philosophy, entitled Houseman and Wordsworth, and again, I'm afraid it's unpublished, are an essential element in any really significant philosophical writing. Geoff and Mary were entirely at one. The disease of contemporary culture that is represented by that kind of one-sided, reductive scientific view that is unable to see that there are other types of thinking. That was a leading preoccupation of both of them throughout their lives. Geoff, I do want to say, having acknowledged the paucity of published writings, and indeed there are very few subsequent finished pieces of philosophical work that post-date that early period. But he was a significant philosopher nonetheless. And I think Peter and Ian will both bear witness to the extraordinary caliber of his philosophical teaching over many, many years. He was a most dedicated teacher. And as Peter said mainly about Mary, but is equally true of Geoff, his dedication to his students was well beyond the call of duty. And many of his students were present at Mary's funeral. His and her students were present at Mary's funeral last week and gave tribute to both of them as outstanding and exceptional teachers. Thank you.